Good afternoon. This is Brian Price, Dr. Brian Price, with Pete Turner on the Break It Down show.
Why don't you give us your disclaimer real quick here so we can get that out of the way?
Thank you. I had to do that, of course. Because I work for the Department of Defense, nothing that I say here should be construed to be the opinion of the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, Air University, or the Air Command and Staff College, but is my own opinion.
Professional opinion, though. You are paid
Sure.
to be smart of this.
I am. And I always argue there's a difference between, opinion and assessment. But
yeah. Well, and also it's interesting because when you see you're an interesting academic, right? The first several reasons. One, you can talk at length as an expert on medieval warfare and arms and armor. You also are a scholar that's actually had his feet firmly planted in a combat zone outside the wire, which is so rare for academics to be able to do that, and able to do it not because you were on a grant and you had like a specific project, sort of like go figure it out. Like that just never gets to happen. And now you work for the Air University in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a neat place to think about the future, reflect on the past, and try to make us a better fighting force. This is not an expertise packet that you can design. When you look back, what do you think about all the experience and the incredible uniqueness of your expertise?
Well, I'm incredibly lucky and blessed, depending on how you look at it. Certainly, I've had opportunities that if I had not looked a second time, I wouldn't have had, the Afghan opportunity being one of those. And you were, in theater too. The idea that you're going to get to go down there, define missions, and then execute them on your own in support of a brigade, that just doesn't happen. So if you're going to go see a war and understand it from the ground up, that would be the way to do it. And I'm incredibly lucky to be able to have done that. That was enabled by a sort of off-the-cuff decision to do some grad school at the University of North Texas, which I had done because, frankly, I wanted some more. Was bored doing just the business stuff. I was like, all right, let's. And then there was in the back of my head was I need to be prepping for my final career also. So what would that be? And I didn't really have an idea until I walked into the department chair's office one day with one of the facsimile edition translations that we had done, laid it on the desk to sort of get into take an occasional course in the grad program, which was my only plan at that point. And Dr. Lewis said, wow, you should be teaching here. I sort of thought for me, it's like, how do we make that happen? That actually sounds like a decent plan. So I went through school with the idea that I would replace the professor that who was my major professor there. The university ran into some budget issues right at the end. I went looking for possibilities for how to tide over in between when I finished on that, and came across the BAE advertisement for social scientist for Afghanistan. Well, I'm not a social scientist. I'm a historian by training. But I had every single thing they listed on the checkbox, including the ability to wander around in armor all day. So I was like, okay, I'll file. I filed at like 12:30 a.m. By 1 o'clock, I had a phone call from BAE. This is 1 a.m. saying, when can you be in Leavenworth? It's like, I'm still finishing up my doctorate here and should probably talk to the spouse. And this was not, and finish my dissertation. So all those things got done simultaneously. I was very lucky. Had a great class at the Human Terrain group. Yeah, you were in that class, so learned a great deal there. I was lucky to get very good assignments with functional teams and really good partnering sort of military units. That was good. And not everything was perfect, of course, but I learned a great deal there. And I think I taught some as well. And then I went to Hawaii following sequestration. Yeah, go for it.
Let me back up here.
Go for it.
So I've done this a lot. I've deployed a lot, pre-deployment and everything else. I had already gone through human terrain, basic training, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And so when I joined you guys, I was going to deploy again with the program. So I didn't have to go through the basic, but they were going to send us through this advanced training, which was cool because we had asked for that initially. You were the only person who said, hey, Pete, you've done this job. Let me buy you lunch. And we went over to that cafe. You remember?
Yeah,
I think I had a patty melt. And we talked about like my approach to asking questions, what I'd seen. And you basically got an hour-long download from me on how to do this job. I think that says a lot. Look, forget me for a second, but your willingness to say, this is a complex job. I don't know what I'm getting into. Everybody's worried about what region they're going to. Like, that doesn't matter. What matters is your team relevant to the command? Is the command able to allow you to be relevant and put you out in the space? Because you need to get out over and over and over again so you can try to understand what's going on in a way that nobody else in the entire battlefield can see. Like, that's not an easy thing to do, to go see what's in front of your face, to go on the same patrol and bring something that no one else can bring back. That's not an easy thing to do. And so your willingness to reach out and say, hey, Pete, how do you do this? Only person who ever did that, who took time to do that. What do you attribute that openness to? Because literally nobody from HTS ever sat me down and said, how did you do this? What worked? What didn't work?
Well, I've always been intrigued with how things work. So I tend to dive into the conceptual side and see, and I think, trying to think it through. But the first step in that, of course, is trying to gather, well, who else knows about this? And of course, that's the essence of what HTS was supposed to be. And let's go find out from the people who are involved in this thing, what's really going on. I had a Kandak commander while I was there who, by all accounts, was very good. He had been purportedly at least, had been a general officer during the Soviet era, fought the Mujahideen, ran a Kandak, big 6'6" Turkish fellow with a curly mustache, the whole bit. And I was getting to know him during my early thing. I asked him, so how would you solve this problem we were having up in this particular valley? He looked at me, kind of cocked his head, he's 6'6", so he's a bit taller than me, cocked his head to the side and said, no one's ever asked me that. You guys have been here for 10 years and nobody's yet asked me how we'd solve this problem. It's like, I said, well, that would be part of the problem, isn't it? We haven't actually asked. To me, there's the essence of good leadership and good management generally, and just job learning, is to go get the expertise from the people doing the work first. In fact, that's what a lot of the decentralization stuff I was involved in the 90s was about. So it's kind of second nature for me. It's kind of also a little bit of reading I've always done on this to try and figure out how to do it. So you were the only person they actually presented us with who seemed like you were willing to share the experience from the ground truth as to what you were getting. And I don't know why that was in the program. I can speculate, but I wouldn't do that here. But definitely, it seemed like that was the missing piece in a lot of our training, and you seem to have it. So, and that's the way I approach villages too. What do we not? Who would know what we want to talk about? I only have an hour. So how am I going to figure this out? And sort of and what kind of questions to ask? Some of that came from you. Some of it's my own. I ask very broad questions and then let them tell me what they thought the problems were instead of suggesting to them, is it this? Is it this? To me, that's begging the question. So instead, I would just lay all that out. The problem with it is it's very tough to train analysts to go out and ask those same questions because they would ask the question and then you get an answer back and it's like, oh, you should have followed up there. Do you see where you should have followed up? It's like, no, I don't see it. It's like, oh, okay.
And also you don't get to ask directly, like there are so many questions that we ask in the military and government that are clearly already pre-answered. They're not a closed question. They're just a ridiculous question. Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Taliban? No.
Well, and how does this question translate? What's the security situation in your village?
Yeah.
How on earth is the interpreter going to translate that? What's the local word in Pashto for security? Which one is he choosing? There's probably 3 or 4.
And since you brought up interpreters, and this is my thing, right? Have you prepared your interpreter that you want to ask this basic question and said, how do we ask this? How do we weave this into a conversation?
Right, exactly.
We just talk. But no. You don't trust your interpreter. You stand next to me. I say the word. You say the words that I tell you to say to that person. At no time will you. Nope. That is not how all this stuff works. So when we talk about these things and how to ask questions, and you're totally right. Like, it's not just, look, there's reasons for closed questions and there's reason for interrogatives to open a question, but most interrogative based questions are very closed, just
the way they're phrased.
Yeah. Tell me about the region. And then they start, and then you ask a follow-up and a follow-up and you go from there. That skill, as you said, is not a natural skill for people. The other thing I wanted to bring up is you made a great point about HTS, and one of its deepest flaws was it wasn't able to build this peer network. I volunteered, and they gave me an extra week in the States, as opposed to in theater, to be a resource to students going through the school. I worked one day, and they kicked me out. because the contract company said Pete is cramping our style. It should be like, well, get comfortable with Pete cramping your style because he is here to do a very specific thing. I'm not doing this to get a free week in Kansas. I don't know anybody in Kansas. I'm sitting at my friend's house. I'm doing this to give you all insight before we go. Was that valuable? No, it wasn't. And when I applied to go back to HTS as an instructor, because I'd been on the side of a mountain, no one knew me. And so I didn't get championed for, and so I didn't get to stay. You think about how much talent left that program because of the institution's incapacity. And so the reason I'm saying this is not woe is Pete, is to illustrate just how challenging it is to create a school that produces relevant people to do whatever the task is. And you guys try to do that at the area university, and I'm not making comments about that, but it is very, very hard to make training equal the task of the tasks like that you have to do downrange, whether you're working at the diplomatic, strategic, theoretic, or ground truth level.
Yeah, and part of the problem is I teach at the operational level, so we're teaching majors by and large at the command and general staff, and their entire career has been built up creating tactical expertise. And they are expert at their individual tactical, no question about it. The trick is now they're facing their second major career phase in the Air Force, as a previous general officer spoke and talked about this. Now they're learning to run large organizations and or to work on a staff where solutions or potential solution options to exceedingly complex problems have to be proposed and thought through. That's a different set of skills than it's been to run a maintenance group or do whatever else they've been doing. In addition, they have to do all that while speaking the joint language, which is Army plus in a lot of ways. The way that the Army has put together the MDMP, the military decision-making process, and what we now call the joint planning process. The two are very closely related, of course. So Air Force officers have not had the Army advantage or the Marine advantage of using these tools since they were young lieutenants. And so to them, they come to the joint table and it's like, this is new. And Chairman Brown has stated very clearly that he wants officers who can speak that joint language. So our trick is to get them immersed in the capabilities and limitations of air power, both as it applies to the joint force and in its independent strategic capacities. It does both. There's two functions to fill. So we're trying to get the officers calibrated to do that. I will say that I've worked and been very impressed with the vast majority of the officers that have come through the program since I've been there, which is 3 years or so, a little over 3. They're eager to learn by and large. They are experienced in at least conflict environments. They've been involved in those. Some have nuanced experience in NATO and the Pacific alliances and so on. And while this is going on, and while we're trying to digest all the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq, the world is still moving. China's still moving, Russia's still moving, Iran, North Korea, those are all still moving. And so the needs of professional military education have to shift to not only prepare them for that, but actually to help them drive the process down a way that's good for us, not so much for our opponents, or better, as they like to say in the conflict continuity scale, that right, we can be in cooperation as well as competition, while we are directly opposed on some things. And this is particularly true of big players like Russia and China, where you can say, yeah, well, we may be in conflict over these things. We may have potential conflict here and here, but there are all these other areas that we have to cooperate in, and there's a bunch that we compete in. That's a sea change for the way that DoD and the federal government looks at these kind of relationships. And it's been around now for almost a decade. And it's still, we're still retooling to try and get that job done. A lot of folks are still sort of in the groove from the long 20-year wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we're in a period of change. So as we look back at these wars, we have to look back and say, okay, here's the stuff we did right. We want to continue those things, just like in a hot wash. But here's some things where we need to improve. And so the trick is to make them critical thinkers while also not conveying that the world is a completely, desolate place and everything is about conflict, which it's not.
You're talking about the operational level, and really above that level, above the level where you're training at, there are any number of other either higher levels of operational level or higher levels of strategic level. And just to make things kind of complicated to the audience to understand how complex this is, a major is really early career in terms of like being a general. So you have O1, O2, O3 is like the young guys, right? And then O4 is major. And there's O5, O6, O7, O8. So it gets really tall really fast. And that means you're able to work jointly, combined in a coalition. And these levels of strategic thinking go higher and higher, weaving in things like the State Department, U.S. Ag, all of these different things. Department of Energy is often a coalition deployer. So that strategic level of thought is challenging. And I want to get into your paper here in a minute, but let's really quick talk about the stack above the operational level.
Well, let's hit the whole stack really briefly, so because a
Please.
lot of viewers won't have seen this before. So at your lower level, your platoon and company level, and to some degree battalion, you're talking about tactical operations. Those are operations where essentially your forces are coming into contact or could come in contact with an opponent. And that's all kind of tactical stuff. This comes from the Greek word tactikos. The Greeks had tactics and strategy, right? And so they talk about the generals, the strategoi. I'm sure I butchered the Greek, but who are responsible for how, setting, should we fight here? Should we campaign over here? Setting where the campaigns go and how the fight is made. And the civilian side came up with the you should fight. At the strategic level, that's kind of, we get that too. That's sort of that's the how we win this war. So our strategy for Ukraine at this point seems to be we provide them with stuff along with our NATO allies and let them fight it through. That's the general strategy. But between those two levels is the operational level. And that level is trying to connect strategic goals and objectives with the tactical forces. So it's the art of the operational art, as it's often called, is the use and blend of creativity at that level, because you want to be strategically predictable. Hey, Russia, hey, China, hey, VEOs, here's what we're going to do if you mess with the world system. And so you want to be predictable in that regard. How you respond, though, you want to maintain that as unpredictability. So, and the way you do that is by putting a lot of creativity into your operational level planning, and then leaving the guys who have to do the tactical stuff to figure out their best way to do the thing. But you give them clear objectives and clear sort of right and left parameters. Now, above all three of those would be the grand strategic level that some people talk about. And that would be your blend across your diplomatic, informational, military, and economic lines. So this is where you bring together your whole of government, your other agencies come into play and such. And all of those get blended to some extent at the operational level, because you're talking at the operational level, typically 4-star commands that are joint in that they use all 4 or 5 services, because we frequently have a Coast Guard component there if you're doing any maritime stuff at all. But you also might have combined stuff with other nations and whatnot. So that 4-star level is trying to coordinate a ton of stuff, as well as the diplomatic, the informational, and all the economic concerns and whatnot. So a lot of that has been focused on the component, the COCOM commander. So the commander of CENTCOM, or the commander of EUCOM, or the commander of INDOPACOM. They are the focal point through which a lot of that stuff runs. And then those commanders, of course, have staffs that support them, who write the plans that give options. They vet them. They then present them to the commander, who vets them again, and then presents options or his selected choice to the SecDef, who's a civilian representative of all this stuff. And then that goes to the White House typically. So there is a sort of intricate, it seems like it's chaos, but there actually is an intricate kind of structure to it that does seem to function in the main. It is difficult to characterize if you're not in it, however. It's difficult to see it clearly how it works. And I think people who have a tactical background don't have much visibility into that either, because they see the results of it. They don't actually see all that goes, what goes into making this plan that they may think is great or stupid, or anywhere in between. So the idea is, of course, that 4-star focal point has to be supported by officers who not only have training, and I think the military is very, very good at that, but also have education. And to me, education is planning for the unknown. That sounds odd, but I'm giving you a ton of tools, or I and many others are giving you a ton of tools, and then you'll have to select from those tools when faced with a new situation. Here's a toolbox, not only these, but find something new, make a new tool to fix this job. It requires, as Aristotle said, creativity. And of course, these guys don't get where they are by exercising primarily creativity.
Right.
So it is a bit of a jump to at that point to then say, okay, you've been following regs and stuff has been your main career, but now I need you to be creative
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and outthink the enemy. Because of course you've got thinking opponents on the other side doing exactly the same thing, pushing the other way. So the trick at this level of education, professional military education, is to try and unlock that, right? Get them so that they will go and do their own self-education on whatever factors they're or whatever challenges they're faced with in their future careers. Because at this point, they've had 12 or 14 years in. Many of them are on the verge of making lieutenant colonels. So I would say they're mid-career rather than younger. And very few of them will go on to be 4 stars. But even if they don't get to the general officer level, they're producing plans and analyses that are driving decisions at the top because they're the guy that has to sit there and think it through. I mean, really think it through. There's no one else to rely on. So I preach to them, figure out what all the key perspectives are in a given problem. Go self-educate on those or bring in SMEs that represent those perspectives for you. And then try to create a plan or a policy that balances all of those, or at least takes them into account.
Let's I want to spend a moment talking about the structure of a combined or a joint force, just to reinforce. Joint is what Brian was saying earlier: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, Space Force. Right? That's us all playing together as a force, and I'm including Space Force because at some point they'll be involved in that way.
Yeah, they're involved every day, so yeah.
And even then, like, everybody's fighting to get a little more turf within that joint thing, right? And so the Air Force is desperate to do something other than, and I'll just minimize their role, manage shit and deliver shit, right? Like they're desperate to like have more space. Commanders get promoted because they deploy their people and go do complex hard shit, even if so they have this kind of internal fighting at the joint level. And then at the combined and coalition level, it's even more so that. And so and also there's I would say, Brian, and I'm going to do a terrible job describing something because he said it's hard to describe it, but it is a three-dimensional organization. It's matrix, but it's got a pyramid of matrices, and each level, the gap between the next node is further and further, so that I always call it the spaceship. The folks at a certain level above brigade are looking at the Earth and going, "Oh, why aren't you just doing this?" And you're like, "That's because you're in a spaceship and you don't see how complicated." And I haven't read all the books, and I can't read all the books to do this. I need a Pete, I need a Brian to help me out where I have shortcomings. But that information only goes. The information tends to just shoot downwards, and it doesn't do so good at coming up and coming back down. Like it's not a communicative path. It's a directive path. One more thing to say: you have liaisons and outsiders who come in, and they attach to this node, right? And so we had a Jordanian colonel. Very common to see this when you have American service members who have well-intentioned, but they'll diminish or mock or degrade the role of that Jordanian, of that Romanian, of that French person who's attached to them, and they never consider them. They know rank-wise where they're at, but they don't treat them like that. They don't treat them with the same deference. An 06 Jordanian colonel will not be treated the same as a brigade commander who's sitting next to him. And so you have these problems all within, like these little cancerous nodes that cause problems for the whole mission. So as we try to lift this whole machine up and make it work, there's a lot of internal noise and chaos that we have. So you're trying to individually create these great people, but they're in this system. It's like they're in a river and it's going to go that way. And they can be like, but I'm supposed to swim that way. You're like, you can only do as much as you can do within this system. It is a very good system at moving stuff. It is very good at delivering bombs on targets or whatever, but it struggles to be reliably and repeatedly good because of the ponderous nature of it. That's just Pete's theory on that. And I really quick want to get to, and I'm going to let you talk about all that in a second. I also want to bring in Joseph Grant's question: is policy created at the strategic level, or is policy handed down to the strategy thinkers? Pete will answer first, and then I'll shut up and let Brian do all the talking he wants. I would say that policy is made at the legislation level because they have to fund it, right? So you need Congress to say yes, or the president to say yes, I'm going to deploy these people. My policy is a policy of minimal intervention, or whatever it's going to be. And then the strategical people get to choose you guys and making those things. I would say that policy drives strategy, but sometimes they can be flipped around. I will shut up now and let Brian respond to all of that. And we are going to get to his paper in a second.
That's fine. I think it's a give and take thing, right? Policy is informed by the observations of the people down in the next levels down as they filter up. If you're a policymaker, you're asking your your diplomats, what are my options here? And then they're crafting some sort of policy, hopefully in response to what the world is doing. But I think it doesn't go one way. It doesn't go down to up, and it doesn't go up down to up, or up to down. It's both. Both should inform the other. Though I think there are gaps when we do our operational level planning, and that's why when we get to the paper, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
I think there are plenty of, right, there are a lot of people who do thoughts about strategy, but strategy depends on what perspective you're coming from. So if I'm a owner of or I'm a agent of a multinational corporation, my strategy will focus on the economic aspects of this, but it's not necessarily my favorite, or it's not necessarily the only perspective. I think it doesn't so much flow from the legislation as the executive, who's charged with that. Although certainly the funding that the legislature gives is important, and those hearings that we have all the time are important. They do impact on it. And so questions like this to me are good questions, because they force us to look at the complexity of what's going on and see that it's really a mesh in an organism where things pass two ways. And in any given instance, it might be more one way than the other. So you really have to look, much like in coin things, you have to look at the particular case and say, where did this one come from? And then you can, so to my mind, historians have great tools for this after the fact. They can go in and see what's happening. The predictive sciences like poli-sci and whatnot try to go in advance. And I think that's very difficult to do, because the world's changing constantly. The variables are changing constantly. And, I salute the guys, and I have a poli-sci undergrad degree as well, so I get it. But it's a tall order to say what's going to happen according to the model of X and Y. I tend to say I like the historical part better, because I can go in and say, well, in talking to everyone involved and looking at all the documents, here's what it looks like happened. It's super complex, but also really interesting.
Yeah.
And hopefully if we look at enough of those, we get some ideas going forward as to what might happen. Yeah. And so when we talk about where does strategy come from, we can suppose for the sake of the paper that it comes from, that it's either perfectly or imperfectly articulated at the executive level, and then it comes down through the DoD that way for implementation.
I want to throw in one more confounding element, because you're talking about the political science, predictive sciences, and really I'll just throw the quantitative people in there. You want to be able to use your quantitative tools in a place like Afghanistan, but it's just not permissible, right? And so we had a guy up here, Anders Core, who's Harvard trained and super talented and
know him well. Yes.
Right. Irrelevant on the battlefield. He needs to sit in the retrospect part, because he's trying to use numbers to solve a problem that the numbers are they're not real. You have to
suspect would be the way to put it, probably.
Yeah. I would say completely fraudulent, but you're being nice. So, and this is for the audience, because Brian will know this. So we have these tools to create surveys. You have to convince an Afghan to leave their home area in the city and go deep, not into the country, past the country, over a mountain, into a place where there is no electricity, and they live in a different century, different eon. And they're going to walk around unprotected, because this isn't their tribal area, this isn't their area, and they're going to run and do a survey in this district. And so we did this because like the military in our program, like, please use this tool. It's available to us. Like, one, it's too slow. It's ponderous. It's so, like, by the time you get it, the Army has moved on to the next thing. Well, we get our data, and the data comes back with a survey sample that was greater than the known population of the district we were in. You're not surprised to hear this, Brian. And I'm saying, when I'm saying the guy who ran the survey, and I'm doing quoted fingers, said there were 20,000 respondents to this thing, meaning he went out and talked for a few weeks to people, and the known population, and I'm making these numbers up, the known population of this district was 15,000 people. So you see the problem with quantum prediction is that you don't even know. There's no way to even validate. Like we have this problem, the known population. What is population? We can't even get a population from this place. It's so remote and dangerous to walk around it. So when Brian talks about these confounding factors, these are them.
Well, in that case, when you're talking about, right, I always look at there's confirmatory research and exploratory. And in most of what we did in HTS could be exploratory, certainly. I can go in and tell you what the factors are likely to be. What I can't do is do confirming quantitative stuff after the fact because I don't have validity, I don't have randomness, I don't have a lack of coercion possibility, I don't have any way to oversee the study. So I can't really rely on that stuff. But I can get some exploratory and tell you what the themes are with a fairly high degree of, I can't rank them, right? And I can't say it's this percentage, but I can say, you know, a lot of the people believe that this religious divide issue is a problem in this set of villages. And so maybe we can address that. And I think in a conflict environment, that's the best you're going to get. When you're trying to extrapolate policy from that and say, okay, well, Afghans say this or that, it's like, yeah, look at those numbers with, you know, one eye closed, because it's not gonna be able to feed that kind of decision making. So don't even look at it. But you know, we did try it.
Yeah.
I don't think that was the center of what we did, but it you know, it was one of the tools in the box. It was like, okay, yeah, I don't need a wrench here, so I'm not going to use the wrench much.
Especially if the wrench is like one turn per 20 days. You know, like I gotta move faster than that, man. All right, let me just say a couple things first. Brian works at the Air University. If you're interested in what he does, you can hit him up on Facebook. That's the place to go do that. You can read his paper. It's very short, this one is, and so I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you're interested in reading that, or just look down below in the show breakout. By the way, if you're interested in supporting the Break It Down show, hey, thanks. I appreciate you doing that. What's the best way? Go to breakitdownshow.com and there's a Break It Down show store. You can see the link down here. You can go and get a Break It Down show shirt, or you can just go to PayPal and put your own little subscription in. Yeah, that's you. Thanks, Brian. Brian's like my Vanna White right now.
Right.
You can go to the PayPal link that's crawling across the screen down there, and or just go to breakitdownshow.com, click on PayPal, and you can put $5 a month, $10, $20, whatever it is that you want to do to help me make this show happen. Man, I'll tell you what, I will put that money to work. You know, we're always getting new equipment. I'm always trying to travel. These are the things. This is why you invest in this. I don't need Patreon. I need you and I need me. Would you buy me lunch? Would you be like, hey, Pete, here's $100. Go do your thing. I love what you're doing. That's what I need your help with. So go to PayPal and do that. All right, let's talk about your paper. And what I want to do, Brian, at some point is get Daryl Morini to come on the show and really have this conversation, because you guys are sort of having this conversation in an academic way. So you're not in contact. You're just saying, hey, Morini suggests this. Here's what I think. Your paper is called A Case for Strategic Design on, quote, a diplomatic surge in Afghanistan, end quote. Let's talk about the paper.
So I was asked to do a review article, and in academia, review articles where you take a retrospective on something that may have had some impact in years past, and then you assess how that might be impactful today. So what's the relevance today? The big R word. How is this relevant today? And Morini was suggesting, I think, in a really well-written way, that when we were crafting our plans for Afghanistan, we were inward focused and we're not taking into account the countries around Afghanistan. You know, what does Russia want? What does Iran want? What does Pakistan want? What does India want? And I think he has some points. His solution was to probably cut excessively to his conclusion, because he does some good reasoning in the article. But his conclusion is that if we had engaged more with those surrounding players, the outcome might have been different, or it might be different, as he was saying in 2010. I don't know that, you know, I think we did make efforts to engage with Pakistan with very little effect. Russia turned out to be more of an opponent and a competitor. Iran was a problematic player all the way along for us. And then India, the more India got involved, that would trigger Pakistan. So maybe he's right, but I don't know. I don't know if that's right or not. What I did have after reading his article, what became clear to me though was that, okay, so if it's true that we didn't have the right strategy and it needed a regional component, I didn't see any real evidence of an overall strategy I saw some fine operational stuff, and I saw the 3 lines of operation we always talk about in Afghanistan: governance, development, and security. And the military folks would tend to say, well, you can't get the other 2 until you have security. And so they saw it as a chicken and egg thing. I always thought they all went together, but that makes it messy, which people don't like. But I think that's true. But that's not so much a strategy as an approach. And so the strategy needed to be, what do we want to have happen here? How is it articulated? And regardless of what that was, that understanding of what the strategic environment was, and it probably changed several times throughout the course of our involvement there, that was then handed down to the operational level planners to figure out how operations would be run in Afghanistan. So we have a process, the joint planning process in the DoD, that takes and is designed to create an understanding of the operating environment, and then do a mission analysis, come up with what your understandings are, challenge those understandings a bit, socialize them to the whole team, and then create courses of action that represent options, ways that you might execute policy or execute operations in order to serve a given strategy. The problem is, one of the steps is take in the strategic guidance. Okay, well, there's no structured way to do that currently. It's just sort of, okay, well, here's what my commander's intent is. Here's what I've read on in the news. Here's what we know as a planning staff. And these guys are typically multi-degreed. They're not stupid. I mean, they're well engaged in the thing, and they do. They're bright as a group. They may not have the SME support they need for a given job, but they try to get that, and they try to work around that. The process allows for either having the SME or not having the SME, or a series of SMEs. And then they go do their operational planning process, which is taught through the joint planning, the JPME, Joint Military Planning and Execution courses around PME, right? You see it at Command and General Staff College up in Leavenworth. Air Command and Staff College teaches it. At the JPME 2 level, it's taught at NDU and at the war colleges and so on. So there's an advanced level to this where you take the strategic level more into account. But still, there's no structure for how you connect those 2 together. So one of the components of the joint planning process is called operational design. And operational design is really creating a picture of the operating environment and how the force, in a conceptual sense, is going to address the strategic requirements, the objectives. And this is a well-known thing that's been practiced since the mid-90s at the operational level and above. So our troops know how to do it. The Army guys especially have been steeped in this. You know, where are my decisive points? Where are my decision points? Where are my lines of operation? What are my objectives? What was my troop to task analysis say? They go through all these pieces to try and create your op order that you guys are following out in the field. And it's known to be an iterative process, right? This doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It goes on over and over again. I mean, cycles through over and over again. Some of these plans get put on the shelf because they're contingencies and never brought out. The big level ones, though, govern the entire campaign, and they include the State Department and DoD for an area over an expanded period of time. But still, there's no way to really connect that to the strategy because there's no structure for that. So what I'm proposing in the article is, what if we use the design tools? And I did not come up with this idea. This is Dr. Jeffrey Riley, who's a big gun in the operational design world, talking about centers of gravity and so on. He's one of the major players in those discussions. We're fortunate to have him at Air Command and Staff. His idea is, let's create strategic design in the same way we create operational design. So let's start with national interests and say, let's identify those, which means you have to understand the perspective of the policymakers. Are they liberalists? Are they realists? What are they trying to accomplish here? And then what are the major things at play in this whole strategic approach to a place like Afghanistan? Now, if you receive a strategy from the civilian authority, which you hope to do, then you simply use this design, a version of this joint planning process, run the strategy through it, and see whether it actually is complete or not. If not, it gives you the tools to propose something back. Well, is this what you meant? If so, great. Now I have that. It's clear, and I can go run with the operational design planning that we need to do. So it takes a tool that we already use at the operational level and applies it at the strategic level, so that high-level operational planners at the Joint Task Force level and above can say, look, is this the strategy that we're getting? And if not, perhaps here are some strategic options that you could think about, because we really need some strategy to govern these operations. We're going to run the operations; they're going to be well done, no question about that. But are they the right thing to do? And that's what the hope is for strategic design.
Damn, that is a hunk of work right there. That's an impressive thing. The paper is short, and
it is short. It's just an intro, really, proposing that maybe this is one of the tools we could use for this. It has been sort of vetted, though. At Air Command and Staff, we usually have about 550 students per academic year, with approximately 125 to 150 of those being international officers. So we get a really good mix of international and American officers in there. One of the specializations you can take in there is the Joint All-Domain Strategist concentration. That really sets you up to be one of these operational planners, or to have the background to do the planning, which is a little bit like the Army's SAM school that they run as an additional year. This is 10 months of intensive planning. And so I think Doc, not to put Doc words in his mouth, and although maybe he's somebody you should have on eventually too, his idea was that, look, we can't just half-ass this idea of connecting strategy to operations. We have to actually get some sort of framework to guide this. And it doesn't have to be this one, and there could be other things too, but we need one. Mm-hmm. And so he proposed, well, look, in light of something better, here's what let's start here. Let's try and use the tools we have now to look at the strategy and see if the things still make sense. And so we teach our JADS graduates, and there's usually 60 per year or so, how to do this. And then they're taking that idea out into the force, where they're getting picked up in air operations centers and strategy cells and so on.
When I hear all these things, I hear the pieces that are supposed to work together and getting better at the communication parts. So we can project and predict how to project these courses. And the one thing that I did really well, that I learned to do by watching each iterative unit come through and really, frankly, screw up, is I started to work on to make them less destructive to their long-term goal, right? However, my ability to negotiate up and over to other areas to help in a scalable way, not there. Because I was good at being on the ground. I was good at taking a battalion and a brigade and completely adjusting how they thought operationally, how they saw things. When all of Afghanistan fell, I'm like, yeah, of course it did, because the government didn't trust itself. We talk about, and I'm gonna poke really hard on this. We talk about centers of gravity. The civil populace is the center of gravity. If they don't believe in their police capacity, their military capacity, their government capacity, then we are losing the fight every day. And so I would go look. And one of the things I did, because I had the ability to do these kind of things, I followed a request from, look, the side of a mountain out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, Brian gets like out in the middle of nowhere, like vehicles will break before they go back, right? We're in a rugged place. So the guys get no firefight. These are Afghans, and they send up through their chain to their government, hey, we need some ammo. So I'm like, this will be interesting. Let me see how this thing, because this is not day one of the war. Like, we have a government, there's people employed, we're trying to make it work. And I followed this request. I didn't have to go far before the request failed. Why did the request fail? Well, I was able to engage with the American, and he said, because of how we look at Afghans and our partners, we look at them as a threat first. And so everybody's got this little like a dossier. And it's like, oh, this guy knows the Taliban. Yes, because they're from this area. Like, it's impossible to not know people from the Taliban, because they literally, Mullah Omar, Brian, lived 3 miles from our camp cluster. So we're talking about, and for those who don't know Mullah Omar, look him up. It's crazy. So the Taliban is from this area. I mean, this is where they're at. And so when we look and say Taliban first, and we don't realize the importance of establishing a government that's moving hearts and minds of the people for the government, not for us. We don't need hearts and minds. The government does. When we miss that piece, we start to make mistakes like this E6 made, who was partnered up with some of their Afghan guy trying to create government capacity. The American killed the request. Why? Because the guy who was out there was tied to the Taliban. Had nothing to do with, like, can this government provision itself? No, it cannot, because of a lack of trust based upon a baseball card. These guys had never met. He didn't call me and say, hey, man, how was this guy? He had no ability to know to call me. None of these things work. So we can get better at these pieces and talking operationally, but look how fucked we were at the ground level to accomplish the very thing. There's no general who's going to command any COCOM who's like, I want more of that. I want more of the government not being able to provide itself. So how do we start to fix these problems when and look, everybody's reporting that they're doing the right thing and I'm successful. I've been a good partner. My partner has advanced, right? But when you step back and you look at the confusion and the chaos and the lack of a strategic win anywhere in sight, I focused on us. Can I unfuck us because we are the problem until we are not?
Well, in coin especially, right? The center of gravity, most analysts would say, and I agree with it, it's the sense of a competition like that. It's a competition for legitimacy between the two players, right? Between the government and the shadow government or shadow governments in Afghanistan. Because the HIG have their own way of doing things. Taliban have their own way of doing things. And of course, General Krulak's idea of the strategic corporal plays out, right? One guy can really denigrate and really destroy the thing, but you can fix things you can only fix a very small piece, but you can have a negative effect that's very large. And so it's difficult to get engaged in these kind of fights for the long haul because someone's going to mess up somewhere down the road. And even then, I wouldn't necessarily agree that we're the problem. I think there are plenty of endemic problems that even if we weren't there, it would be messed up. The kind of problems may vary a little bit, but I think getting people to understand the colliding perspectives in these things is the first job. And it's not easy. We are one of the perspectives. We are a heavy and important one because we bring so many resources to the table, but we're not the only one. And we tended to look at things, I think, even these analysis that we're talking about, the Morini article, most of the plans that I looked at said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. Here's what the Afghan government's going to do. And here's what the Taliban's going to do. Okay, well, that's three of the major players.
Yeah.
What about the rest of them?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's Morini's point, is we didn't take those things into account. And he's probably right on that point. Whether or not we, engaging with those players would have given us a different result or not, I don't know if I agree with that.
Right.
But I still think that it still has to be taken into account in some sense. And the best we can really do is focus on our span of control. And try to fix that, much like you did there, I think, right? Okay, I can fix this little piece. And then, following traditional oil spot theory, if this works, people will look at it and take it as an example, which is what I sort of think about with the strategic design stuff. It's like, okay, we don't have a mechanism for this now. So let's send a bunch of officers out there equipped with the tool and let them show it in staffs and use it. And then they'll modify it. Of course, I want them to modify it and change it into whatever they need the tool to be. And I think I would expect Doc Riley would want the same thing. And then, okay, now you're thinking about it from a different perspective. And that's ultimately what we have to do, is get those perspectives represented at the planning level. There are times if you're going nose to nose with China over Taiwan, say, yeah, Taiwan's important, Japan's important, Australia's important. The big players, though, have an outsized role for that. It's just we can't lose sight of the other players and what they're contributing as well, because much like the sort of chaos theory, butterfly flapping its wings, these small variables can turn out to be very, very important in the long run.
One of the things that we do poorly is we have these meetings. Rick, let's get all the stakeholders in here. And there's a thing called the RIA, the RIAA. Basically, it was like we were assessing how we were doing in Afghanistan. Sure. I would raise my hand, and I love to be a pain in the ass like this, because again, I submit we are the biggest problem, and I would say there are no Afghans in this meeting. Well, it's classified. Like, can we unclassify it and just have the Afghans here? I mean, this is their government. Why are we at that? And it was such a problem, Brian, that we would look at this, and then in the meeting, this is a fucking thing that happened. They're like, medical in this district. Well, sir, there's no hospital there. We're giving it a green. Whoa. There's no hospital there, the colonel says. Well, sir, we've lowered the bar in that region. Aces. We're doing great. So no Afghans in the room. We're moving the goalposts around. There was no general. There was no diplomat that's like, that's what I want. I want more of that. They want less of that, right? And so we have these things where we're so locked in operationally, strategically, super strategically, whatever it's going to be, that we lose sight of the fact that, hey, where is our SME, right? You make this great point. Where is our SME? We have this belief that it's 20 individual wars. It's worse than that. It's 20 isolated individual bits of amnesia. Like the guy who's there in 2018 has no idea of the history of what's been there before him and the vast number of mistakes and the small number of wins. It's incomprehensible to them that anybody else has ever done a good job or that anything is lacking. They just start with all over again, right? And so we would have this institutional amnesia that cripples the ability to even have a good design, because we're constantly redesigning the design and like coming in and saying, look, I don't know how many units came in and said, we're going to push Al Qaeda, the Taliban, Haqqani network. We're going to push them back. We're going to defeat them. Like, no, stop with that crap. Just do your job well. Yeah, if the Haqqani network shows up in a mass formation and you want to go fight them, God bless, go do that. But we're never going to be, doesn't matter how good we strategiate or operate or tactate, if our orientation and our preparation are so out of scope.
Yeah, I think part of the way we fought it with, brigades rotating in and out feeds that. Although I don't know that your experience is the same as mine in that regard, because I actually did see the French were there for a long time and they had better continuity, I think, than we had in a lot of ways. And there were things, when I went back and dug in the databases when I got there was all kinds of interesting stuff, which I was digging out and giving to both the French and the provisional reconstruction team on the American side and so on. So I think the experience is going to be different depending upon when and where you were, like in any coin thing. There are some systematic problems, though, I think, in these things. That connecting the bits is very difficult. We don't typically do a great job at all that coordination, particularly with partners. That's totally right. I might say there are exceptions in there. We worked with the French, and I was with them for a while. That partnership seemed to be very good, especially given the French commander's problem, where he is a 2-star, is reporting to an American divisional 2-star, which is weird right off the bat. And then he also has to report to the French government because they're controlling his caveats and whatnot. So, but I think they did a stunning job given those caveats. And the coordination, I thought, was as tight as it could be given the circumstances. We've got a question here from Mr. Grant again. So did China and Russia's proxy war accelerate the collapse of Afghanistan? How much influence did they exert, I think, as you're looking for, on the terror networks working against us? That's hard to measure, I think, at this point. My instinct would, without intel and looking at the red folders, would be yes, they did play a role. I do know in open source stuff that the Russians were pitching to Afghans that we were supporting ISIS and so on and so forth. None of that was actually true, but they were trying to make the case. And like most, these things tend to be like advertising. You say it often enough, loud enough, some people are going to believe it. So I think that certainly had a role. I don't know that we'll ever be able to quantify that, right? The Taliban and the Haqqani network and the HIG shot Chinese rockets at us forever. So certainly they were getting them from somewhere, whether they were buying them or giving them, I don't know. But I would say in general, yes, they probably did work behind the scenes, as competitors generally will do it, as IR theory says they will do. Right. Anything that dings the leader a little bit, that doesn't bring in their own interests too much into clashing, they'll probably do. But we don't have evidence really yet, or at least I don't have any that I've seen that's unclassified, at least, to say how much that they might have brought that about. It's a good question, though, and I think wait another 10 years. I hate to put it that way, but some of the data will come out and we'll get to go look.
Yeah, they for sure played a role, and then their ability to show, like when psychological operations work, there's more than just two values: believe or don't believe, right? There's also just confusion, and two of those benefit Russia, and we also create our own confusion. Well, that also benefits Russia. So we have this problem with our ability to reliably and repeatedly see and do a good thing. There were times, Brian, and maybe you had experience with this. There were times when I could go out and find invisible wins that we didn't know, but it was a reflection of the government working. And I'd be like, hey, by the way, you don't know this happened, but these guys as a community came together and they came to the governor to solve a problem. You didn't have to do anything for this win. Let's look for these and see if we can amplify that and not over amplify. The military loves to like, let's get in there and really, like, no. Let's just be gentle with these things it's challenging. If you were gonna, and if I can get Morini on, let's have him on. But if you were
sure.
gonna ask him one thing, because look, you and I know when you write an academic paper, it is a thin thread. It is not it is not a Wikipedia rabbit hole. You get one shot, 800 words, 1,200 words, 3,000 words to explain something very, very complex, and so you just get to talk about the top of the veneer of the problem. What would you want to ask him about? Like, what did he not get to put in because it just didn't fit within the framework of that paper?
Probably if I had one question, I'd say, what would you change 10 years down the road in the
Mm.
paper? But if it was, what would you have expanded more on? I'd say digging into the nuances of the relationships with powers like Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. What really leads you to believe that they're going to be partners with us at solving this problem when we're also competitors? And I'm sure he would have some very nuanced and useful analysis in there that would not make the final cut necessarily, but could be crucial to understanding why he thought that approach would pay bigger dividends than perhaps it did. But the bigger question I would ask is, right, we're 10 years down the road now.
Yeah.
What would you change
Mm.
if you were writing this today? I think, I think he did a lot of, he brought my perspective argument into sharp focus, something
Mm.
I always teach to the students. And I like that because I think without identifying those perspectives, you don't have a prayer's chance of actually finding a policy or a plan or defining operations or objectives that are going to work. Now, you have to take them into account. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you have to bend to it. It just means you have to understand it to some extent. When we talk about the SME piece of that, um, for complex problems, by definition, experts will not agree on the solution.
Right.
So one SME is not going to help you. You're going to need to understand the length and breadth of a problem set and say, okay, so I will need multiple SMEs. Now, yeah, I'd love to have them represented, in a two-way dialogue, but that's highly unlikely. More likely, someone's got to synthesize all the stuff that's being studied and written about it, and then filtering through them. So I have to trust them to be as honest a broker with synthesis as possible, and then go through and use that as best I can. Because if you're in a planning staff, you don't have infinite resources or time. So you're trying to do the best you can with the small team you have to get at understanding, which is the hardest part of the thing. And it's never done, right? So it shows it as a step. Understand the operating environment. Well, the first time I read that, I was like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
Understand the operating environment. I will never understand this place. I understand some places I was in at that moment for a little while.
Yeah.
I'm sure those places are all changed now.
This is such a great point because, like, I needed more access every day to the battlefield because I couldn't stop finding things that were vital for the command to know. However, if you spend, and this is where Lawrence messed up in Arabia, when you spend all of your time out, you lose your influence with the command to nothing.
Yeah.
So that when you show up, they're like, "Who's this guy?" I wasn't ever part of the unit I was in. You weren't either. And so unless you have command level, powerful, repeatable trust, you're irrelevant, and you have
But
to work.
you earn that trust, of course,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I'm relevant. So
Right.
I understand the mission that you're trying to do here. I understand how you're trying to do it. So
Right.
to my mind, it's a bridging function. I go to all the staff sections and say, all right, what are you working on? How are you doing it? And then you go to the commander after the day's over and it's like, okay, so what are we thinking about for tomorrow?
Yeah.
And that I found really useful. And I think commanders found it useful also to be able to talk to somebody who wasn't on the staff, would give a different straight up view, right? My OERs were not written by the commanders. So
Right.
my career, such as it was there, was not actually controlled by them. But my was very much wedded to their mission in terms of, look, we need to help make this place better. And I know you guys really want that. So here's what you're thinking. And in many cases, most of the plans I saw took most of these things into account, and I could add some nuance here and there. Now, I did a different deployment where I worked on more other things, and I don't think that the connectivity was as good there. Not with me, but with the things they were trying to do. But I
Sure.
think in the human terrain area, the two brigades I worked most closely with did understand the complexity of the thing. We're trying to get that depth, and there were successes. Like we had when the rains and the floods came in Kapisa province, we had the army and the provincial government working together in an operations center to
Mm-hmm.
provide the solutions to the to the population. And that took some work to do. That was the provisional reconstruction team setting that up and making sure it happened. It's not in the usual scope of work of a PRT. And yet they said, well, here's the best effect we can make. We can build more schools, but this would be the biggest benefit because people die every year in these floods. So why don't we, the military has the trucks and a few aircraft. We have the aid and they have the governmental authority to go get it done. So why don't we teach them how to create and run an ops center so that they can, ameliorate the same problems that we face, but it's lesser for them in some ways because it's a smaller group. So I got to see some of that success when it does work. Like when the Qurans were burned, we didn't have the same sort of problem in our area that they had in other areas about that. So I got on the road and talked about why that was. And functionally it's people and stuff. So there were successes that you could point to. And I think if you go in with a profoundly either too rosy or too negative a view, you'll lose the ability to have influence.
That's fair.
So
That's fair.
You got to have the influence first. And you got to win that. By doing that, you got to come back with a win.
Yeah.
So I face that too.
The importance of relevance, you're unique in your ability to do that at least once, right? Twice with the two different brigades, but it is very hard. And as you know, it takes an enormous amount of work to build a reading list, to build influence. Because if you don't have an audience and you write a 40-page paper and you can't condense, and I'm not saying you didn't do this, but we as a group often did this. Like, I've got my 40-page paper. Like, it's nothing to do with what the commander is talking about every day. Stop looking into coochies. They are not the problem here, and so we and this is just one augmentee, right? Like, group. There are so many of them that are 7 clicks off of where they need to be. So they're just shooting the rounds, but they're never near the target because
and they're expensive rounds because they're being supported by the brigade and all that. So, and they create a lot of noise in
one more question about Morini before.
Go for it.
Too much time. Sure. Okay. Is he talking primarily about diplomats working outside of Afghanistan to focus, like, I'm going to work with you, Pakistan, on the Afghan problem, and we are going to deploy and work on that? Or does he mean also in Afghanistan as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't probably put words in. I let him answer that one. But I think my impression from the article is that it was a blend of those things. And I'm, as I say in my review article, I am sure that the diplomats involved there had that kind of connectivity and put it together in the way that Morini would talk about. What I don't know happened is there was any connectivity between what was going on there and the operational planners, except for those lines of effort of governance, security, and development. And I think that gets hand waved a lot in the planning process. Yeah, that's the strategic guidance. We're doing that. That's probably okay. Let's go on and now figure out operation because that's what I know how to do. And so I'm going to do this operation. It's going to be beautifully run, which it is. It's going to be synchronized. It's going to do all those things. And hopefully it'll be the right thing. And if you've got a Pete on staff, then we will avoid doing a lot of the bad things. That's fine.
Or anything. Stop doing stuff.
Even if it's not a Pete, it might be, we had a very good 9 shop in one of our places that I didn't have to do a lot of that stuff because the 9 already had it covered and they were doing a great job at it. So I could dig into other things like blue on greens and things like that. But we don't have a systematic way, I think, of saying, here's what our national interests are. Here's how that applies to country X, Y, and region X, Y, and Z. The State Department does all that, and they do a phenomenal job of that. They operate not by planning the way the military does, though. They operate by engaging with places. And it's a different approach than planning is. I think it's valid, it's just different. And so getting the connectivity between those who are doing the engaging and those who are doing the planning, that's why I suggest strat design is a planning tool that might give you insight as to what the engagers are doing so that you understand it better. So you can put it into your terms or translate it, if you will, into terms the planners understand so that as they make creative decisions in talking about how operations are going to be run, those decisions will take into account the real intent of what's going on above them. We're missing that now, frankly. And I think in our autopsies of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, not having a strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq that works will be the thing. And even if we did have a strategy, it didn't connect operations.
And it certainly didn't connect the preparation for the tactical people. All right, listen, we have had a fantastic conversation. I'm going to work on Morini, And definitely anybody at Air University you want to bring in, I'd love to have these conversations, because look, we're sorting through really hard stuff, and it needs more sorting. We haven't sorted it out. When a guy like you and I can't be called up by the Lessons Learned Center, and it's its own little incestuous group, and all these things are closed and cloistered, we got a problem that we're not going to solve. We can have all these great tools. I would submit that in an environment like we worked in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's not an OODA loop, it's a DAOO loop. And you can't work fast. This is not a fast thing. It's a delicate thing. It's a deliberate, it's a critical path problem, not a repetition spin problem. There is a place for that.
But that's an interesting, my last deployment, I observed that we would spin around, being a tempo-based force that we are. We believe that if we spin faster than the opponent, we will ipso facto own the initiative. Right. And that's John Boyd's contribution to the force. Yeah. It filtered through a bunch of other people, but that's, instead of fighting with mass the way we did in Korea and to some extent in Vietnam and certainly in World War II, now we're fighting in the time sort of domain. Yeah. Boy, Jeff would probably have a heart attack that I was using his domain word. But what I observed is that the insurgents operated not inside our loop, but consciously outside the loop. Yeah. So we could spin as fast as we want. In fact, spinning faster was better because it would cause exhaustion. So they let us have that high optimal. Yeah. So I think that time is a domain, and that the way you use time, just like you use any other domain, the air, the sea, it defines to some extent how your force fights. And we define ourselves by that OODA loop model, that observe, orient, decide, and act model that Boyd came up with. Good model, and I think it does, doing a lot of martial arts stuff, I think it does actually apply to how we make decisions and how we observe. The problem is that there are different approaches to the time domain, and I don't think we understand that. I really owe the community an article on that, because I don't think a lot of people see it that way. So there are little tools like the strat design tool and things like that are getting their way into the force. They're not well known yet. But I think the people that we're training are bright. And really the charge that I end up sending them out of the classroom with is, look, you guys are going to be the ones to have to solve a lot of these problems as you finish off your career. So here's a bunch of tools. And I don't know which ones are going to be useful and which ones aren't, but we'll keep trying to give you more tools.
Well, listen, I could do this with you for a lot more time. I want to say so many things, but I've had you for an hour, and I want to respect your time, even though I've taken an extra 7 minutes. I will. I'm going to wrap this thing up. Anything in closing before I shut this thing up?
No, Thee, I love the show. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate your time as well.
Yeah. Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.